Hello and welcome to the 9th bonus video in the 20 years of MCF celebration. I'm MCFPapa. This is the third part of the retrospective on the whole Mystery Case Files series, and in this video I'll be covering what I call the Swan Song era, the final games that Big Fish Studios put out. While I thought the games in this era were decent, this was the first time in the series since Ravenhearst where I grew more disinterested in the new entries, and I consider them to be a step down from the earlier Golden Era MCF games. After 13th Skull, Big Fish Studios made Escape from Ravenhearst. I considered the core elements of the Golden Era of MCF to be the hidden object scenes, the puzzles, and the environments. And while Escape from Ravenhearst handled puzzles and environments very well, they totally botched the hidden object scenes. But we'll get to the big negative I have later. The story is that there have been mysterious disappearances around Blackpool, and so the Master Detective returns to Ravenhearst. But I guess they didn't want to call the game Return to Ravenhearst again. The Master Detective still has their car from Dire Grove, but it seems like it's taken quite a beating since we used it in that game. The Madame Fate bobblehead even breaks down after a few clicks. As we explore the Ravenhearst grounds, the ghosts of Emma, Rose, and the twins return to warn us to leave, which is probably the smartest thing a character has said in this whole series. But while in Return to Ravenhearst there was an imbalance where Emma barely showed up at all, here all the ghost characters have roughly the same amount of screen time. And thanks to the much higher quality cameras they used for the game, they didn't need to put nearly as many ghost effects on them to mask poor green screening, and even the green screened humans look better too. I love how the Master Detective seems quite done with the Dalamars at this point, and he's willing to take a lot more risks to do things in this game, like climbing down a garden hose as a makeshift rope that's only attached to a small spigot on a crumbling building. Rather than try to find a way to climb over or around Ravenhearst's gate, the Master Detective decides to just rip the whole thing down, even if it means wrecking his car. Hope the MCF agency has good car insurance that covers signs in the windshield. In Return to Ravenhearst, there wasn't a really good reason why we didn't explore more of Ravenhearst Manor, but at least here in Escape there's a very good reason, because the mansion is a burnt out husk. However, there are still a few familiar elements visible. I love how we pick up the same ladder we used in Return to Ravenhearst and use it again in this game. And a few of the scenes here reference things from Return, like the trunk hidden object scene, and stuff from Roseville and the Twins area being dumped under the bridge. We saw the lighthouse in the distance of Return, but here in Escape we actually get to go there and explore around. But this game's story really picks up when we dig up a grave that turns out to have our name on it and the date we're playing the game. This is another thing that the I Spy games did, but this was the first time that this sort of thing was done in an MCF game. Well, unless you want to count the end of level screens from Huntsville and Prime Suspects. The core of the game is that Charles has us trapped in his underground complex and forces us to go through and relive each step of his life. Finally, we get some backstory on Charles, who in the earlier games was not really given much depth. And what I love about designing the story this way is that they can cram a ton of exposition into the game, but it doesn't feel like exposition. We as the Master Detective have to learn each new twisted fact about Charles's life, but it's perfectly in character for Charles to put us through all this absurd complex because he's highly obsessive. First, Charles was obsessed with Emma, and then he was obsessed with Rose, but in this game he's obsessed with the Master Detective. And throughout our journey in Delamar Land, Charles will frequently talk to us on either intercoms or on TV screens. I feel Charles' actor Dennis Kleinsmith gives by far the best performance out of any of the MCF live actors. He does a great job changing his emotions and expressions mid-sentence, and it perfectly brings to life Charles' insanity. What's strange is he also played Charles in Return to Ravenhearst, but I thought his performance in that game wasn't nearly as good. So I don't know if it was a better scriptwriter, a better director, or if Dennis just decided to go all in for this game, but whatever the case, I love how it turned out. It's such a shame, though, that Dennis really hasn't had much of an acting career, because studios should have been chomping at the bit to hire him after this. He did a fantastic job. I couldn't even imagine how traumatized I would have been if my younger self that got scared at Emma's skeleton in Ravenhearst tried to play this game. The environments we explore are generally run down like they were in the last two Ravenhearsts, but now they're a lot more twisted and made to be intentionally unsettling. The pregnant women in the hospital whose bellies pop up and down, the sounds of kids being beaten and abused and crying in the house, the manic and insane screams from the asylum. So much of the game is super disturbing. It was definitely a bold choice to design an MCF game with a story this dark and unsettling. While yes, Return to Ravenhearst was probably just as dark, it wasn't nearly as in-your-face with it as Escape is. Charles's mother Abigail is probably the most disturbing of the animatronic mannequins in the game. We have to set the clock to certain times, then have to do gross tasks for her, like getting up close and personal to pop her pimples and clipping off her toenails, and then using her leavings to open a hatch. 13th Skull revealed that Abigail had over half of Phineas Crown's fortune. That means even more gold than what we saw in that game's bonus game. And yet Charles's home seemed to be fairly modest and small with not much luxuries to speak of. Given how Abigail is giving Franco the Excessive a run for his money, it seems she squandered all of the fortune, probably on food. With an absent father and a mother as awful and gluttonous as that, yeah, you can understand why Charles became so messed up. But even though the game shows us this, it never tries to muddy its story by making us connect or sympathize with Charles, just understand him. And just because we know that Charles fed his mother a pie full of dynamite because she committed him to an asylum, that doesn't mean we should do the same to our own parents. So take that away as a lesson if you can take anything from this video. I enjoy how they made each of the areas in the game have its own aesthetic, with the hospital being decrepit full of medical waste and the asylum having a whole fake snowy environment. The asylum feels more substantial to explore than the other areas, and it even connects back to the outside. However, I wish they had done more with the backtracking to the Ravenhearst grounds. All there is to do is cut wires off the intercom puzzle from Return and solve the V puzzle box to get the dial you need for the final game. I would have liked to see a few more new rooms to explore for this part of the game, like maybe even bringing back side areas from the original Ravenhearst, like the garage, shed, and greenhouse, which were just randomly absent from Return to Ravenhearst. The asylum has some of my favorite moments in the game. I love the code puzzle where the numbers are shifting every so often and you have to quickly enter them to open the cells before they switch to a different code. One of the puzzles is so complex that it can be considered a bona fide super puzzle, the first proper one in the PC series since Madame Fate. Charles learned to create door locks to bind a person's soul from his father in the asylum, and in the tape by Dr. Lanswiller, he records that a mysterious raven even visits the cell that his father was kept in. Even though they were wanting to wrap up Charles's story in this game, they were already setting up a continuation with his father. I love the first 3 areas, but I am a bit disappointed that the final 2 areas are so short, consisting of just a handful of rooms each. It doesn't seem like there was any cut content, but to see 5 doors in the hub, I would have expected 5 roughly equal-sized areas, especially with the 5th area being its own entire separate mansion built underground. Over the course of the game, Charles brings each of the ghost characters back to life so they can power his machine, but at the end we're able to get hints from the newly human again characters to shut down the machine for good and burn down a second of Charles's mansions. Home insurers must hate him. I don't know why Charles lets himself be burned at the end instead of trying to run away. I guess he thought he could just be revived again. I don't know. That being said, there's even a bit of humor in this dark story by them playing the Wilhelm scream when Charles dies. Overall, I adore Escape from Ravenhearst's story for managing to make Charles into a captivating villain, and the best villain of the series for a lot of people, myself included. Its biggest flaw is probably the time travel elements. At the end of Return to Ravenhearst, Victor travels back in time to 1895, and it really feels like they had some other plotline planned for the sequel involving time travel, or us going back to the time mentioned in Emma's diary, kinda like we would eventually see in the Dalmar Legacy. But in Escape from Ravenhearst, they just kind of gloss over it as, oh, Victor traveled back in time and began building this underground complex. Charles, I guess, was revived, but it's just confusing because if Victor traveled back in time, then Charles would still be alive at that time and not need reviving at all. And with a time machine, Victor could instead just stop us from killing Charles in the first place, but the events of the first 2 games still happened without any change. And if Charles and Victor had a time machine, why wouldn't they just use it at the end to escape again? In most stories, adding in time travel just creates more trouble than it's worth, I feel, and Escape from Ravenhearst is no exception. But now we get to the big change in this game. Every other MCF game had well over a dozen hidden object scenes, and you could argue an infinite amount due to always having randomized objects in them. Yet in Escape from Ravenhearst, there's a grand total of a whopping 1 hidden object scene. About a third of the way through the game, you find a magazine with the scene in it, and by completing it, a page rips and you get a feather. I still don't get what was preventing the master detective from just ripping the page out right away. Perhaps it was a little prank set up by Charles because he knows the master detective would stop everything to do a hidden object scene before continuing the investigation. Here, though, they were paying homage to the earliest hidden object games, which weren't on PC or even in books, but in print magazines like Highlights, which I believe still prints hidden pictures which are very similar in art style to the one in this game to this very day. On its own, I could even appreciate this as a cool reference, but that's just the issue, it is on its own. I'd love it if it was just one special scene among several normal ones, but since it's the only one, it just feels far more disappointing, especially because it's just black and white and very plain and basic, compared to the other games with their vibrant scenes jam-packed with details, and the item list for it is always the same too. This game instead has a bunch of morphing hidden object scenes. These are said to be caused by the ghost's spiritual energy, and they're okay, but all you do is stare at the image trying to find things that are changing. At least with hidden object scenes you know what you're looking for, but in these morphing scenes it could potentially be anything. Now it's not that hard when you've played the game and know what things are morphing, since they don't ever change these objects. But when I first played the game, it took me ages to do a lot of the scenes, to the point where I got super frustrated and used a ton of hints. And the bottom line is it made me borderline dislike the game when I first played it, due to it just being very unfun to go through and do morphing object scenes like this. It's mind-boggling to me that they decided to almost totally abandon one of the founding elements of the series, especially when 13th Skull had done hidden object gameplay so well. Because of that, it's just a point-and-click game. A decent point-and-click game, especially with the strong story, but nowhere near the level of the earlier games. And now for the Collector's Edition content, or should I say the lack thereof. Escape from Ravenhearst is the single worst Collector's Edition I've ever seen. First of all, while it includes a strategy guide, it doesn't include any wallpapers or behind-the-scenes concept art or anything. Elements that are basic inclusions in pretty much every other CE. The bonus CE content is integrated right into the main game again, but it's far less substantial this time. In the hub there are 5 doors to open. If you have the standard edition, you put the key in the lock and the door opens right away. But if you have the collector's edition, then it instead pops out tokens which you need to match to images in the environment. These are usually pretty easy to figure out where to find them, but for several of them you're required to backtrack to a lot of older areas, and by having all these tokens in your inventory it makes it get a lot more cluttered and harder to sort through your items. In Diregrove and 13th Skull, the CE content felt like it was adding extra secrets or Easter eggs for you to find, but in Escape from Ravenhearst the tokens feel a lot more like padding or busy work. For the CE, they hid a bunch of morphing objects in the journal pages for you to find. Now I like these as a bonus feature, giving more purpose to the journal, and since they're just an optional bonus thing, it's a lot more fun to find them than the morphing object scenes themselves. Collecting them all unlocks 2 hidden object scenes, but just like the base game one, they're monochromatic and feel just as dull and basic. These images depict a man, and by beating the hidden object scenes you get a final journal page. These seem to be a teaser for Charles's father. I'm not sure if at the time they thought of naming him Alistair or if they had something else in mind. This is a cool teaser, but in one of the updates to Escape from Ravenhearst, they inadvertently broke the journal pages where the last journal page of the story doesn't spawn. It's supposed to have the epilogue on page 39 where the master detective says confidently they'll never again return to Ravenhearst. Ha! However, instead of that, it will skip over that page and spawn the final page showing the 2 images as page 39. This creates a few issues. First, it means that people who own the CE only have access to one of the bonus hidden object scenes, since the last morphing object you need is on the final journal page that doesn't spawn properly. Second, since the glitch is also present in the standard edition, it means that people who bought the cheaper version get free access to the bonus teaser of Charles's father that was meant to be paid additional content. And third, it means that people who own either version of the game are prevented from seeing the ending text of the game, which was meant to be a conclusion to the Ravenhearst trilogy. Overall, Escape from Ravenhearst just leaves me conflicted. I don't know how many people were expecting a super dark psychological thriller out of this series. Probably a good chunk of people on Big Fish who enjoy the more casual, laid-back experiences got put off by this game, and it got significantly lower reviews compared to 13th Skull. And it's quite a tonal whiplash going from 13th Skull to this game. But even though Big Fish made a weaker entry compared to what came before, they were down but not out yet. 2012 marked the release of Shadow Lake, the last main entry made by Big Fish Studios. The big change they did for this game is bringing back hidden object scenes. Crazy, I know. These are more of an expansion on the quasi-hidden object scenes found in the vignettes of 13th Skull. Only a few scenes in the game are one static screen like the older hidden object scenes. Usually you'll have items to find in the zoomed out scene as well as ones to find in vignettes, sometimes even finding items in multiple rooms. This adds a nice bit of complexity since you don't know for sure what room or vignette the items will be found in. There's even some randomization in these, but it's not as much as the earlier MCF games because they made sure to guarantee certain items always spawn. That way you're finding at least one item in each of the rooms and vignettes. For Shadow Lake, the story is that we've been asked to Biddeford, Maine by Cassandra Williams, a psychic consultant who believes there's a massive mystery to uncover in the town. Cassandra is played by Leah Thompson, the highest profile actor the MCF series ever had. I'm sure you can recognize her from her roles in some of the most classic and iconic movies to ever hit the screen in the 80s, like playing Kellyanne Bukowski in Jaws 3D or Beverly Switzler in Howard the Duck. Also, the character of Ghost Patrol Tech Kelly was played by Leah's real-life daughter, Madeline. Remember, folks, nepotism can get you everywhere in life. But speaking of the Ghost Patrol, they're by far my favorite part of the game. They're a perfect satire of the ghost hunting TV show genre, a genre that somehow is still going strong on both TV and YouTube despite never finding any real ghosts. The leader of the Ghost Patrol, Jack Talon, acts comically over the top on camera and pretends to make the prison seem haunted. This might be a bit exaggerated for the game, but it's exactly how real ghost hunters act. And the reason the crew is hightailing it out of Biddeford when we arrive is because they actually found a real ghost that dented a thick prison door and injured Jack. That would skyrocket their show ratings, yet they're too scared of a real ghost to actually film the full episode with it. Fortunately, the master detective has been around and seen some paranormal things, so we stay in the town and investigate. Since the Ghost Patrol immediately leaves town, Cassandra is the only character we interact with for 95% of the game. She gives us a radio and will frequently talk to us and give comments about the areas we explore. She's the one responsible for giving us a list of items to find in the locations, and then once we collect them, she's able to use psychic powers to detect something in the environment. Cassandra will also give us drawings. With these, we need to find an area in the locations that matches with the drawing. These work the same as the door tokens from Escape from Ravenhearst, but I feel they were done much better here. For one thing, they aren't trying to sell them as alleged extra content. Because the drawings are in black and white, it adds more of a challenge to figure out where they should be placed. The drawings are generally self-contained only to areas you're currently investigating and require a lot less backtracking. There are more puzzles with these, and some hidden object scenes are specifically so you can have items to set up an area properly for the drawing. It's interesting how this game has almost a level-based progression to it. We explore an area of the map, then identify all the drawings, then bring them to Cassandra to do a psychic reading, then unlock a new area to explore. There are 8 of these readings in the game, and even though they all use the same sort of puzzle connecting the squares that are playing a video in motion, there's a nice difficulty curve where they become more complex as you go through the game. We pieced together the story of the past with each of the readings and learned the prisoner Jamie Monahan dug up a horn, which was then taken by the prison warden, then by the warden's son Billy, and then by Billy's school teacher, and it both possessed each of them and caused them to die in various grisly ways. There are a number of moments in the story I find funny, but I don't think they were meant to be. The school teacher sees Billy as just fallen from the roof, and yet immediately the horn possesses him and he just stops caring about Billy at all. The small town sheriff reminds me a lot of Andy Griffith in his appearance. I enjoy that the game doesn't try to do the common horror trope of people being in denial that anything wrong is going on. When the sheriff learns about the horn possessing people from the coroner, his immediate thought is to go straight to the church for an exorcism. And while I do enjoy most of the 3D effects in the game and think they hold up pretty well, the rocks falling from the church look laughably bad, and it kinda takes away from what's meant to be a very serious scene. But then we get to the big bad villain of this game, Adramelech, the powerful and ancient demon who was buried beneath Shadow Lake. The Native Americans of the area were able to keep it at bay and protect the world at large for years, even though because of it they became outcasts and were seen as cursed. By the way, the Amasakanti were a real Native American tribe which were a division of the larger Abenaki tribe, and they did live in the main area, but they stopped being a distinct tribe in the early 1800s. I think it's kinda weird that they took a real tribe and wrote a fictional story about them stopping a demon. But then I guess it would be weirder if they had made up a totally fictional tribe for the game. I'm not sure. It's not explicitly stated, but it's implied that the Amasakani tribe were the ones who cut off Adramelech's horn and killed him. But the demon's evil still permeates the town, and it seemed it caused the warden's wife Ellen to commit suicide. And it was through the demon's influence that everyone became possessed and went crazy that we see in the psychic readings. From the first time I played Shadow Lake, it was just incredibly hard for me to take the threat of Adramelech seriously. Most of the game, it's just the little horn getting passed around like a hot potato from person to person. And at the end, Adramelech is just an old skeleton in the cave. Not threatening at all. The Dire Grove Banshee, I feel, did the controlling innocent people horror a lot better. And all we see of the titular Shadow Lake is at the very end of the game, where we just hand the horn to Ellen's ghost, presumably exorcised of all evil and therefore putting an end to Adramelech. Or is it the end? Because in the end credits scene, we see that Kelly is possessed by a small fragment of the horn. While they clearly intended to continue this plotline at some point, we've never gotten any follow-up from it. And so this could reasonably be considered, yeah, it's the end of Adramelech. For some reason, they got rid of the case report in this game, replacing it with a task list that periodically gets updated. And I mean, yeah, the journal wasn't really needed in the other games outside of maybe a few codes that were written down in it. But how hard could it have really been to have a developer sit down and write a few paragraphs of flavor text for every major event? I don't know, maybe it was too much to ask for, and I'm not one to criticize writing or not writing, considering how long it's taken me to even write some of these scripts for the retrospective. They changed up the way you navigate this world compared to earlier games. The rooms aren't all connected to each other. Instead, we get a map which splits them up into smaller areas. And in these smaller areas, we can freely explore them like the old larger hubs, but I just don't really care for them being broken into chunks. I think what they were trying to do with this was make Bitterford seem larger in area than some of the other earlier game areas, but I don't think it works out very well. The Master Detective weirdly has a motorcycle he describes as my trusty old Norton, even though we've never heard any reference to a motorcycle before in the series. It seems he loves it so much that he shipped it across the Atlantic to drive it around in Maine, and this proves canonically that the Master Detective is absolutely terrible with money. He seems to only be in the US for like a day or two, so he should have just rented a car for like 1% of the price of shipping a whole heavy motorcycle both there and back to England. I don't know what he was thinking. I love the aesthetic Shadow Lake uses with a hazy green mist over everything. They made a lot of stuff look overgrown due to the town being abandoned for 40 years thanks to the earthquake. There's also a 1970s flair to a lot of the areas. We find an 8-track tape in the warden's house. The library has a card catalog. There's a local independently run drugstore that hasn't been bought out by Walgreens or CVS. However, just like real-life CVS's, we do run a car into the drugstore. The only thing that really doesn't fit the 1970s theming is the Madame Fate pachinko machine. It seems way too modern looking for 1973, and I really doubt a small town like Bitterford would have even known what pachinko was at the time. Now, to talk about the collector's edition content. They gave a grand total of 3, count 'em, 3 wallpapers in this, which is not much, but at the very least it's more than the 0 from Escape from Ravenhearst. There's a pathetically short bonus game at the quarry, consisting of 3 new rooms and 2 additional puzzles, one of which isn't really a traditional puzzle, but just figuring out numbers. And again, that's not a lot, but it's better than the none added in Escape. For beating this bonus area, we get a mask that unlocks morphing objects in the environments. These are fun to get once again because they're optional, and unlike Dire Grove, here there is a reward for them. Getting all of them will make the mask pop out a ticket for Fate's Carnival, teasing that the next game will be a sequel to Madame Fate. And when I first played this game, seeing that ticket pop out for the first time and realizing Madame Fate was getting the sequel is probably the single greatest amount of pure jubilation I've ever felt in one of these MCF games. And it came out of Shadow Lake of all things. Can you believe it? They put in a strategy guide to the game, but weirdly for some reason decided to lock it so it only shows you the page that's relevant to what you're currently doing. I don't get why, because it was nice in other strategy guides to look up other portions of the game whenever I wanted. And then there's the behind the scenes video, which is very cool to hear from a lot of developers who worked on both this and several other past MCF entries. However, the last line of the video is, let's see how many more of these fun games we can put out in the next few years. And this line still breaks my heart every time I watch the video, because the answer to how many more MCF games they'd put out is 0. After this, Big Fish would put an end to Big Fish Studios as a hidden object game developer. But why? Well, they were chasing the mobile market with games like Fairway Solitaire and Big Fish Casino. Far cheaper to make than one of these live-action hidden object games where you need to hire actors and directors and costume makers and film crews. And mobile apps are far more profitable too, with people spending a ton of money on microtransactions. It's a lot easier to get people addicted to virtual gambling than get people addicted to finding hidden objects. But I'm proud to say I'm one of the MCF addicts, not the gambling addicts. Shadow Lake presumably had the highest budget out of any of these MCF games, and I like to joke that they blew all their money paying Leah Thompson for this game. But Shadow Lake also had quite a negative reception, and I'm betting it was the least profitable of the games. According to Big Fish's website, it has to date the worst selling collector's edition of any MCF game. I'm not sure how accurate that actually is as a statistic or metric, but I'm betting it probably is the worst selling. And I think that because Shadow Lake also had the lowest review score of any MCF game on Big Fish's site at 2.7 stars, which still to this day is the lowest in the entire series. And I don't feel it deserves that at all. It's miles above the quality of many of the Epix era and Grandma era games, and you'll see what I mean when I get to those retrospective parts. I wouldn't even consider Shadow Lake the weakest of the Swan Song era. I love Escape from Ravenhearst's story, but I'd say Shadow Lake is the better overall game. And while I really enjoyed the Fates Carnival we got that was developed by Elephant Games, I would have absolutely adored a Fates Carnival game developed by Big Fish themselves. Even if it was just as flawed as these Swan Song era games, it would have more than made up for it by having live actors to portray Madame Fate and the Carnies. In terms of the great tragedies of human civilization, I think at the top there's the burning of the library at Alexandria, then there's the sinking of the Titanic, and just below that is the fact that Big Fish didn't get to make any more MCF games. When this game launched, there wasn't a single hidden object scene added in the collector's edition. However, in a patch a month or so after the game came out, they updated it to add in 2 hidden object scenes. One in the jail cell of the sheriff's station, and one in a storage shed that's outside of the church. These are pretty basic compared to the main game ones, and just take place on a single screen with no extra rooms or vignettes. And completing the 2 of them allows you to complete a golden MCF badge, which is just a little decoration on the HUD. It's not much, but I appreciate the gesture, because I've never heard of any other collector's edition with lackluster content actually getting updated to include a bit more. And these 2 hidden object scenes and the golden badge also stand out as the absolute last piece of MCF content Big Fish Studios ever made for the PC. They began the series with a bang back in 2005 with Huntsville. They ended their contribution to the series with more of a whimper. And even though I would consider these games to be the weakest Big Fish Studios made, they are still very solid entries in the series. I've really come around to these games and appreciate them a whole lot more now than I did when they were new. The live actors really add a lot to these games, and at the very least they tried some new things in them, even if it didn't always work out. That's the thing with the Big Fish Studios games. They weren't just trying to make a hidden object adventure game. They were trying to make the hidden object adventure game that's the best of the whole year. Many of the later MCF games are perfectly fine, but the Big Fish Studios games were setting the bar of quality far above everything else, and the developers were always trying to build and innovate on what they had done previously. There's just something special about the classic Golden and even the Swan Song era games, and I'm just glad we got to have as many great games as we did. There's a parallel universe out there where the series never took off past Huntsville or never even began at all. The Big Fish Studios games have a certain magic to them that I very much doubt we'll ever see again. Either because other studios just don't have the budget, they don't have the developers, or they don't have the time to focus on MCF as much and make a truly standout game. And in the next part of the retrospective, I'll talk about the second team to step up to the plate for the MCF series, Elephant Games, and share my thoughts on the Elephant era of MCF. So like and subscribe if you want, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next bonus video.